Alexei. I got it. Yes. Yeah. Oh, let's do it. There we go. I got it. We practiced the pronunciation in the Russian way before. Now, I'm excited to have you on the podcast to talk about music, language, consciousness, and how maybe even some theories on, or hypotheses, I don't know if you consider it a theory or not, about the origins of music and language and consciousness and things like that. But I first wanted to just introduce you by way of how you and I met. Well, I mean, we met a couple times at a mutual friend's house. And then I think a couple months ago, you had a salon where the salon was really interesting, which was what is music, right? And so you were playing different snippets of sounds, right? It was some what I thought were just random sounds, like garbage sounds, street sounds that didn't mesh into stuff. But but it kind of coalesced over the clips that you chose into some kind of form or question of what really is sound or music. Like, we know what sound is, we can see that or hear that pretty clearly, but when does it move into music? And I thought that was a really interesting salon. So I thought we would have a conversation about some of the work that you do. Before we get into that, if you could say really briefly, just a quick little bio about you. What's your background? And by the way, you're a beautiful piano player. I've heard you play pianos many times. You're very, very good. But you're interested in music, not just from the perspective of a player, but of really understanding what it is and its nature.
Yeah, more like in scientific way, which again has been like a tradition from where I have come. Of course, like now I have to add that it is like a dead tradition.
What tradition?
A tradition of like musicology, like
musicology,
Soviet musicology.
Oh, so this is more traditional, like the way you approach music is more traditional to where you come from.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Where do you come from?
Yeah, from USSR. Basically, I was born like in Moscow, 1964.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah. So basically, like
we should have done a show on that first. That's interesting. Okay. But okay. So that's where you grew up?
Yeah, and I was educated. Like basically, I left Russia when I was already an educated man, and I got like my first job outside.
Oh, okay, so you were an adult when you moved to America.
Yeah.
It wasn't as a kid.
No.
Did you get a degree in college in Russia?
Yes, like I got my PhD from Moscow Tchaikovsky Conservatory.
Oh, okay, that's your PhD. That's a degree, yeah.
Which is one of like the top schools, like actually still in the world. Although like today it's not as good as it used to be. Like when I was studying, I graduated 1989.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and.
You graduated with your PhD. You got
and I studied like in parallel, like as music theory, composition, and then ethnomusicology.
Okay.
So I was lucky to get like very good teachers.
You had a paper you sent me that was for an encyclopedia.
Yes.
Entry in some organization I don't know.
It's Elsevier. It's like one of the leading, like there are like 4 leading publishers of scientific literature, and it is one of them. And it issued Encyclopedia of Language. It is going to be renewed, like a new edition this year. Yeah. And the article about evolution of music and evolution of language, like was written by my friend, like he's a Spanish linguist, Antonio Benitez Bornaca, and myself. And it's basically, it was like a very short sort of summary of our research.
Findings and research, I mean, like it was interesting because for me, it was a lot of terms I didn't know.
Oh.
Right. So I gleaned some stuff and I have a whole bunch of questions about it, but it was technical. You were really digging into what this, means. You're using the research, and it was a world that I'm unfamiliar with. But I'm interested, and I want to bring to the audience some of the ideas that you have, some, ideas about, again, language and music and what its origins are. So let's get into this. One thing you said, and I thought this might be a fun way to start, you said this in your paper, is you defined, or it sounded like you defined music as fundamentally contemplative. That was a phrase you used in that paper. is that, music, you said as a statement, music is fundamentally contemplative. But the thing that I found interesting, do you agree with that? Am I misunderstanding what you're saying in that?
Well, it is true. More specifically, we listen to music as though it is some sort of sound object. And our ear is trying to extract certain properties of it.
Okay.
Like rhythmic, they could be time related, frequency related, or timbre related.
So maybe there's this is what struck me, is that the thing that music does to me as a non-musicologist, just a normal person out there, is it does not feel like I'm contemplating it in the same way as when I'm contemplating a painting, a sculpture, a movie even, or a piece of literature, poetry, or something like that. There seems to be something very unique about music in the realm of art, which is its ability to just grab you emotionally without the contemplation. Like it feels like when you're in a concert, when you're listening to a piece of music on the road, when you're, a symphony or whatever, that you're just swept away with you, almost like your mind is shut off in a sense. Whereas with literature or even a movie, like a real, I just saw a movie called Heretic with Hugh Grant. Do you hear about this? I think it's a real, have you seen it?
Yeah, no.
I really recommend it. It's a really tightly done movie. It's a twist on the horror. It's really interesting. But like, to really understand it, you're experiencing this, it's very tightly done. Like it's mostly done in this house. It's like a maze that, these two girls, these Mormons knocking on doors, Mormon missionaries. And then this guy kind of puts them into this world where they have to kind of contend with their belief of God and the Mormon church and things like that.
So it's more like a theater.
Yeah, exactly. But what my point is not to get in the movie too much, but my point is that what I found myself doing is, in the moment of watching the movie, I was trying to understand what was going on, listening to the words. And then afterward, there's this ending scene and it shoots out. Then I found myself thinking about it. In other words, contemplating it, contemplating the meaning. So when you say contemplate, I think of it, contemplation, in that sense of like, I have this thing that I just saw or heard or read or whatever. And now I'm thinking about that. And that's what I think of contemplation. So with music, it's like, it just hits me. And I'm listening to a song. I don't turn it off and I'm like thinking about the song. It's done, right? Maybe I'm still crying or laughing or whatever, right? But I'm not thinking about it much.
Perhaps we should speak about different types of contemplation.
Yeah, that's
because not all of them are the same. The reason why we chose to use the word contemplative to characterize music was mostly because of trying to draw the position to language. Because when we listen to sounds of language, our brain doesn't contemplate. It kind of like immediately breaks whatever the flow of sounds that we experience into phonemes, and then sees the groupings, how those phonemes are grouped into syllables, how syllables are grouped into words, and how groups of words are kind of phrased and how they form sentences. So it all becomes structural almost immediately from start, nearly automatic. There were experiments when they would throw garbled text, for instance, at people, and people segmented without breaks, they artificially create. Whether it is visual or whether it is audio, they both kind of.
Because I've seen the audio, the visual examples where they misspell or they have letters missing, and my mind just snaps into it and I can read it, despite the fact that it's it's RD and it's all abbreviations. It's like, oh, I can actually read this pretty well.
Because it's almost automatic for our brain to segment. That's a default operation once our brain decides that if we hear something as speech.
Yeah.
And here is the uncertainty, because there are some types of what they call quite common, how do I call it, musicalized speech. Or in contrary, it could be music that is kind of verbalized. Take, for instance, example of rapping. Like it's kind of exactly like, on the verge of kind of music that is turned more like into speech.
Sure.
And on the other side, you can have
music. Oh, music turned into speech.
Yeah. You can have speech turned into music when you have like readings of holy books, like in many church traditions.
I see. So
they
you're
kind
saying
of recite it, like they sing it out, like they don't like say blah 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 blah, blah 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 blah. So they hold pitch and then vary the pitch. They phonate. That's what like linguists.
Well, just so I understand, so you're making a distinction between music into literature, or music into speech versus speech into music, as one kind of grouping of things we can do, and the music into or the speech into music. The analogy is, or example is rap, and rap, and the reason is the reason because it's music is the fundamental thing there. Is that what you're saying? So
well, music also can have words. Like so, words can be in a song, or
that's what I'm trying
it
to
could be like word per se.
Yeah.
What is more important? If it is word more important, then you end up with musicalized speech.
So, like most lyrical poetry, the word is more important for a lot of lyrical poetry. Yeah. The music, especially like for for thousands of years, even with the Greeks and the medievalists, the troubadours, for instance, like they played a lyre, but the words are really more fundamental than the music. Yeah. Whereas I think like what you're saying in modern music, for example, like rap or even, a lot of most folk music, the words are way secondary. It's more about all the music. And okay. So I've made that distinction before. People got really mad at me because I do reaction videos of like different songs. Like I did Bob Dylan and Tupac and all these rappers and things like that. And one of the things I point out about the music of even Tupac and rappers is that the music is still more fundamental than the words. Although I think with a lot of rappers, unlike a lot of other music that's contemporary, the word is actually more important than most folk music. So of the modern genres of folk-ish type music, so taking apart like big symphonies and things like that, it seems like rap has elevated the word more than other genres.
Yes, I think that would be fair characteristic.
Bob Dylan he might elevate the word more than like the music seems secondary in his music.
Bob Dylan, it's more typical of like lyrical poetry or epic poetry. Epic poetry, by the way, also is closer to word. Like music there is secondary. They might use most traditional forms of what they call singing, like epic tales, for instance. Like they use some kind of melodic formulas.
Sure.
And that is why they might sound like as though it's a song, and then what we hear is a verse that is like repeated like non-stop, basically, like hundreds of times. But in reality, like to those people who perform it and to their audiences, it is like text, and like the use of music is primarily mnemonic. So that it would be easier for them to memorize. Yeah. Memory.
One of the struggles I have in talking about literature with people that I think you're touching on, that maybe you can elaborate on, is we've lost so much in the last like 150 years, let's say. As much as I love modern culture, actually, in so many ways, I love the technology, so I don't think it's the technology. I actually think it's the way culture has moved away from the arts, especially in the West, in the fine arts. Yeah. Like they've really, they've embraced science and technology, but for some reason they also just kind of left behind arts and, in general, which to me is absurd. Like you could have both. There's no reason to have neither either. You don't have to make the choice between the two, but so people don't seem to understand the point you just made about the underlying value that speech and the musicality of speech and the verse and lyric poetry, as throughout all of human history, that was the dominant way of not only conveying knowledge and information, but conveying moral truths, like all the imaginative realms people went to was through poetry and verse. There was some kind of musicality was attached to it, whether it was the Greek chorus. Even in the way that the writers in the Renaissance, like Shakespeare, there's still a meter to the way on stage that he's drawing these things. That's what's so difficult for people today to grasp about Shakespeare, is not merely the beautiful use of language as the words he chose and the phrases, but the musicality of it itself that today we don't appreciate in general, unless it's in modern folk music.
I think the reason it happens is just because of lack of just general competence in music. That's like it was like a very, very prominent, because what you're talking about, this separation, like the border probably would go by the Second World War. Yes. Because before it, like the situation was quite different.
Yeah.
And say, for instance, if you take even like typical outlets like newspapers, like New York Times,
they had poems all the time.
Yeah, they had like critical discussions, like nitty-gritties in like this musical composition.
1930s, 1940s. I mean, Burton Braley is one that I like. He's early 1900s. Yeah, he was a constant columnist doing poems, and there's so many of that.
Oh, with poetry, it was even more than with music, probably. Yeah. Americans were so interested in poetry, like, and even you look at the great American poets, like
Robert Frost, Walt Whitman.
They had like international recognition.
Sure. Oh. Yeah, and it seems that something died out. World War II. I always try to help people see, because so many people, their thinking is, it's. There's poetry people, there's music, there's art people, and then there's science and technology people. Never should the twain meet, right? Never should the two meet. And I just don't, when I look in the past and I look at thinkers and intellectuals and high-minded, the most abstract thinkers you could think of in the past, a lot of them dabbled in poetry. A lot of them loved poetry. They all trained in poetry. Maybe poetry wasn't their fundamental output, but they all had that as part of who they were. And it seems to be again, like here's maybe World War II, we could say, is the moment when we started going away from that after hundreds of thousands of years of development. All of a sudden, 1945, and we're done.
It was a big cataclysm, a big shaker, like socially. There are numerous reasons why it happened. Like, of course, like number one is like the number of killed people, because like most like people.
What does that have to do with poetry?
Where were people coming, like, who basically were fighting for their countries? Most of them, they were like young, educated people at the top of their creativity. They came from cities. So in cities, like all European cities, they had long traditions of going to opera, for instance, or going to lead recitals where they would like listen to some romances. But
that still happens in Europe more than America.
More, but it's not nearly as big as it used to be in the 19th century. Like again, like all you have to do is read newspapers, and you would see like in all major nations.
And it was popular.
In Germany, that was like at the center of public
that's my point in my argument to people.
Discussions.
Yeah, it's like it's so dead. It's so crazy how much of an outsider I am as a lover of poetry and literature. I can only talk to other people who are in the liberal arts. Whenever I try to talk to business people or science-minded people, they're just not usually interested.
Because they don't know. The competence is lost.
Well, that's what I'm saying. To me, the issue is why. Because it's so ingrained in who we are as humans. And like you're saying, like you could look at evidence of it was just ubiquitous. It doesn't and throughout all intellectual people for all of human history, they were, I don't care how science-minded. Newton, even his prose in Latin was beautiful, versified prose, and a lot of there's a beauty to it because he was trained on this stuff. So everyone.
He also was trained in music because at his lifetime, in order to get a PhD in mathematics, you had to have a PhD in music.
I didn't know
had
that.
To write a composition.
That makes sense.
A polyphonic composition, and then to present it in front of the jurors, and then who were musicians, like professional composers, and they had to okay it. Otherwise, he would be turned around, and then he would have to write another one.
And so
in UK, it was like a standard, like in Cambridge and in Oxford.
Well, and more evidence is just the Olympics in the early years had a poetry section.
Of course.
So it's the body and the mind. So to me, again, it's just such a tragedy of the last 80 years or whatever, that this has been completely sliced off from human life for almost everybody, except for a few weird people that appreciate it for whatever reason, because they had a teacher that didn't ruin it for them or something, or they had a natural proclivity, or they weren't good at the sciences and maths as much, so they naturally got into the like what else was left, like, and that was kind of me. Like, I wasn't a whiz kid in math or science, or I didn't even remember the science. I'm sure I was fine in science, but math I definitely wasn't. So I but I was really good at reading comprehension and literature and things like that. So I just naturally did more of that. But that seems to me such a horrible situation.
Well, like, again, like, as I named, like, one of the reasons was like replacement of like millions of people who came like from educated like strata of society, who themselves knew how to play an instrument or to improvise, and like what to listen to, like if they go to like some like event, for instance, what to appreciate, how to kind of approach it, and how to judge what is good, what is bad. And then they were replaced by people from rural areas, like who were coming from with completely different music and completely different poetry, folk like art, basically, which is like very different from like art like form. That was like probably number one reason. Number two reason was politics, because as a result of all of this clashes between First and Second World War, basically we had nation fighting nation. Like, as a result, it was the consensus amongst artists like became drastically or even should be calling it like anti-nationalistic. They got scared, like, because like if we are propping forward German art, like others are proud like of French or whatever, then what, we end up like fighting each other, like whose is better, like that kind of a thing. That's how they started perceiving. And on top of it, like, it mixed with colonialism, because if you remember, immediately after the war, you had like that issue with India, that it suddenly like this whole area, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, they became independent. And then it raised the issue of cultural colonialism, as like where you have like European countries as though superimposing their cultures on local cultures, and like there is this issue as whose culture is better, like who is first, who is second. So as a result, the consensus turned into kind of denying nationalism, and as part of it came the desire not to compare. You see?
Yeah, that was the next phase.
Yeah. When they were saying everything should be judged by itself, like within its own frame. And then pretty soon in 1980s, like it led to Western systematic musicology. Systematic musicology is a discipline that basically is supposed to compare different music cultures and kind of like define what is in common and what is not in common, what is unique between them. This whole thing collapsed. Because in amongst Western musicologists, basically the consensus became not to compare at all. Just like that there is no history of music, world history of music, that there is no evolution of music.
Like multicultural.
Because like in evolution of music you have stages, and stages again, like it's like, on higher stages, people became too sensitive to it.
Yeah.
And then they just like abandoned the scientific foundation of music. And especially, again, most research was and publications were founded by American universities. And Americans, they always were crazy about behaviorism. I don't know if you're familiar in psychology.
I know of it.
It took over in 1930s, like completely like dominated everything. And it still like carried its influence on. So as a result, American ethnomusicologists and systematic musicologists, they basically want to study people making music instead of music structure per se.
Oh, that's interesting. So you're saying because like the influence of the behavioral psychologists on academia and scholars in general, people in musicology, rather than they were influenced by that, and they decided to study more like some African tribe playing or whatever, and they were interested in the tribe playing music more. and the psychological implications from this behavioral psychology.
Yeah. How do they see it? Why do they play it? Where do they play it? On which circumstances? What do they mean?
Rather than like, what's the nature of music and the nature of the individual consciousness and the relationship of the two, which is what you're more interested in.
Well, what I'm talking about, I would like to see it more like linguistics, because you also have like multiple languages in the world, and in each language you have poetry, for instance, or like literature, but then they all are different because like the languages differ. And how do we know that languages are different? Somebody has to kind of measure them in some way, to compare, to see like what kind of sounds do they use, how the sounds are kind of connected together, what they allow, what they don't allow. Look, for instance, you mentioned meter. Like some languages simply don't allow certain meters.
Yeah.
And they're just impossible. And because of that, like physiological property, for instance, of binary meters, the ones that are like ta 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 ta, like they all sound kind of like as though they're purposeful, directed, like strong. For instance. English, by the way, is also closer to that, as opposed to languages that support, like, for instance, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. They sound more entertaining, like anything in this meter, like if you have
I know, like so as an example, maybe Arabic languages are more
Persian languages is a good example. It's very rich. It allows also for even
it's more musical by nature. It sounds more musical.
Well, it's kind of closer to like origin, is like to what do you call this whole family. It originated in the area of India and Persia, basically. And
so it hasn't been as changed. Well, it hasn't been as affected by the Germanic as the English has.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. Grammatization. And also those languages, like Persian language, for instance, is comfortably supports like pentametric kind of construction, so it can be very easily in 5 or in 7. It's just as common, like, and it easily rhymes. The same thing with music. So that is why music, what you call common time, it's common only in English language. If you take like Persian language, it will be completely different commonalities.
Yeah. So, okay. So what I'm interested in, or like what I was trying to get at, and what struck me about what we were talking about in terms of music and the contemplative life is like, one, we've lost something in the West with our leaving away from it, which is leaving the fine arts, not being educated in them in the sense not of a formal education, but in the sense of it just being ubiquitous in the culture in a way, and which I think is a loss that we don't appreciate anymore, which I think is a major loss to us as human beings and our consciousness. And it's a real loss. So I wanted to kind of dig into some of your theories to the degree that I understand them, but you could help me understand them a little bit. So part of what you're trying to accomplish, at least in that one paper and other work you do, is look way back into human consciousness to see where there's either, the different theories about like music and language and how they develop either separately or together or intermingled in some way, right? As the mind develops from, primitive, sapiens into Homo sapiens, right?
Yes.
That whole process. So here's a question, because I want to make that relevant to today a little bit if possible. So what role do you believe our evolutionary past, if any, plays in the way that literature and other art forms shape our emotional and cognitive experiences today? Or does it? Does like, so like the evolutionary biology or evolutionary psychology, is there something in the echoes of our past that is still resonant and important to us today from music and literature?
The foundations, because like our brain, like if you're familiar, is basically modular. So like we have like a core of the brain, which is like the most ancient brain, which is like shared with reptiles, and then mammalian brain and so on. And like what distinguishes human is like, of course, like the frontal lobe. And these are like relatively recent developments. Basically we can track as like brain like becomes like more sophisticated, how the communication becomes more complex,
So let's
starts involving like more nuances, like
let's create a scenario.
Becoming abstract too.
Yeah, let's create a couple scenarios then to see what you think of these. So let's say you have a kid born in New York in 2000, so he'd be 25 now, and he never heard any classical music. He's only exposed to, and I mean only, like he doesn't even get this in movies, like just zero, anything except maybe heavy metal or some, some forms of modern music that's everywhere. Popular music that's everywhere. And that's the extent of it. So even his movies are limited, right? He doesn't even watch movies. So his artistic intake is almost non-existent, let's say. I think there are people probably like this on some level.
Yes, of course.
So, and then take his next door neighbor whose parents don't have a television. They're the weird kids. And they, they listen to classical music and, they listen to Bach and Mozart and all that. And they, have to read great literature, the poetry. Do you think that it's actually their brains will look different? Even if they're both, let's say they're both genetically similar and they have similar capacities for intelligence, however you want to think about that. Do you think that one might be the kid who listens to Mozart will have a more developed, complex brain and ability to deal with complexities more? Or what kind of impacts do you think?
Not necessarily.
That's what I'm thinking.
The brain remains basically the same.
Yeah.
So
what would be the advantage?
It's like tools. Like you might use them or you might not use them. So the person who just like listens to like some very simple, basic music and kind of doesn't grasp much from it is just like not using the tools that is there at that person's disposal.
So is it just a preference between the two? That's what I'm trying to get at.
Well, of course, like from actually performing music, there are like some changes in the brain, like that actually demonstrable.
Well, let's
so from that point of view, like for instance, a scientist can like look at encephalogram and then tell that if you play violin, for instance, or if you play piano.
So you could see how and that to me makes sense. Like I bet you could do the same thing with like just somebody who's really good at soldering or something like complex uses of their hands to build stuff.
Yeah, it has to do with hands.
It has to do with their hands, I would imagine. So that makes sense to me, but I'm just trying to get from, let's just pretend for a moment the mind of these. Let's say they're both interested in being engineers, right? They want to be computer engineers, both of them. I'm just trying to get, is one better than the other or not?
No, you cannot say that.
So it's complete preference.
Yeah,
okay.
And you don't know what the outcome is going to be.
So there's just no advantage to listening to the great music and the...
Well, from that point of view, no. But from the point of view, if you start asking about like some professions, for instance, like a salesman, a profession like that are more social, that depend on you placing yourself in shoes of other people, for instance, or kind of understanding their motivation. Then here, like if you are musically kind of gifted, that would show some advantage, because music evolutionarily differs from language, as that it specializes on communication of emotional states and what do you call conditions, properties of your character. Basic, say for instance, a person who is outgoing versus passive person. Like that's what music shows, basically.
But what I'm trying to get at, because what you just said seems to almost contradict itself to me. In the sense of, because I asked if there was a difference, and then you said no, but then you said there is a difference emotionally, but emotions.
Oh, but it's not catchable, like objectively, like by measurements or by.
Well, why not? Why can't?
Only maybe by tests. Like if you start like doing some tests, like what they especially today call emotional IQ.
This is part of the issue to me. Then I think of how we understand human beings and how we measure human beings and the success of human beings, the flourishing of human beings, and the abilities intellectually of human beings. Because if you're telling me that one has a more robust emotional life because they listen to these great works,
No, I wouldn't call it robust, but like I would like more emphasize like empathy, like ability to kind of.
Well, that's what I mean, but that's more robust. Like, there's just more there, right? There's
okay.
like, that's what I mean by robust. It's like, I'm more robust than a lot of skinny people because there's more here, right? Like there's just more is what I mean. You know, so you could have a really thin life, emotional life, or you could choose to have a more robust, thick life, emotionally. And, you know, to me, that is a difference. And at some level. And so the question is it preference only? So is it something you're born with or not? So
much of it is probably determined by, like, again, your parents, like, because, like, as we know, emotional traits, they're very much like passed, like, through, like anger, for instance, it has been like quite well researched, like that people who are predisposed to bursts of anger, like their children also have high chances of like having that kind of a thing. And a person like that is not going to like a very delicate music, like which has like lots of different sensibilities, like different shades of, for instance, sadness. They would want like music that is very aggressive, like hard rock, like or something of that sort. And the people who are very sensitive emotionally, in contrary, won't like that kind of music because they'll perceive it as too rough, too primitive, too kind of unsophisticated, and like imposing itself. Like,
okay.
So there would be some division, like based on what do you call inborn temperament and
okay. So again,
emotional state.
Playing out examples. So one guy, his parents don't listen to music, great music. They have these issues emotionally in terms of outbursts of rage. They have a difficulty with impulse control, things like that. With, you know, so they overeat, they overdrink, and they get mad at each other a lot and things like that, right? Now let's say, so then you're saying that because of that environment, the child and the parents are more likely to be attracted to music and emotional music and art that reinforces that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And moreover, there is going to be feedback. Because if that's what they're going to do,
that's where it keeps going back.
It will get stronger in
so
that way.
Yeah, I mean, that seems pretty obvious to me, and I agree with that for sure. My next question then about this, you know, going into the consciousness, have you ever seen the Stanley Kubrick movie, A Clockwork Orange?
Oh, of course. It was a classic.
So do you remember how, like, in
the
that,
Beethoven.
Yeah, they kind of force
how they kind of twisted it.
Yeah, they twisted it, but they also, I remember, it's been a long time since I've seen it, and I don't think this is in the book as much, but they kind of brainwash the kid, but to try to train him, because he's like this violent youth who like murders people, right? And they're trying to fix him, and isn't it Beethoven, or who do they play?
Ninth Symphony.
Yeah, it's the Ninth Symphony.
Ode to Joy.
Yeah, Ode
which
to
is
Joy.
like Schiller's like poetry, which is millions embrace each other.
Yeah.
It's basically pacifistic.
Yeah. So my point is that can you, let's say that kid who's the engineer with the angry parents, let's say at 13, he starts getting seriously exposed to greater art. And somehow they help him get into that art more. Maybe they don't force him like Clockwork Orange because they like hold his eyes open.
You cannot close your eyes.
Yeah, and that, like, I think is a negative association. You don't want that. You want the voluntary. Yeah. But let's say that happens, then do you think his hardwiring will change over time if he has, let's say, positive experiences around these classical pieces, and as well as literature and art and other forms?
You see, like with art music, it's quite different. It's very sophisticated, and it's like not only one factor that determines like things. Like, of course, genetic factor is important, but like there are other factors too, because in order to extract something from music, there are like two sources. Basically, semiotically speaking, there are two sources of information in music. One is biologically ingrained, which is shared by all humans.
Okay.
Which, for instance, such thing as like a sudden accent, like in the music, like raise dynamically, it becomes like loud, like on a specific moment. That causes
It's like it gets
contraction.
quiet and then it's boom.
There is nothing you can do about it. Even if you're the most relaxed person, still you'll experience contraction of your muscles, like, and peripheral nervous system will get activated. That is why, for instance, in Western popular music, you use syncopation even in very relaxed like music, because by doing that, they're trying to pepper it in a way, to kind of like make you kind of like excited. It's like coffee.
Get your heart up, right?
Yeah. Sure. And another example, if the music leaps, like the melody leaps, like you feel like as though it's like you're spending more energy on it compared to when it steps. So versus you see that if the melody only moves like without leaps, you will feel calm. And it has nothing, you don't have to learn it. It will be biologically ingrained. So there are basically in every expressive aspect of music, there is something that is biologically ingrained.
Yeah, there's a basic about all human cultures, is what you're saying, that certain sounds will elicit certain responses.
Certain aspects of sound.
Certain aspects of sound will elicit certain...
So, for instance, the meter, if it goes 1, 2, 1, 2, you will feel like more active, determined. If it is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, you'll feel more relaxed, more entertained.
Yeah, it sounds
like
a walk.
If the music is like the speed of your walking, you will feel casual. If the pace, the beat, you feel like as though it is fast.
You're saying that's
you'll feel as though you're running.
Biological,
and
neurological.
Feel excited, yeah.
Yeah, you're saying that's neurological.
That's exactly like and that is why like we can hear music of some other people belonging not to our culture and we can understand it.
Yeah.
As opposed to language. Yeah, because like if you're listening to Chinese language, you won't understand anything, no matter like what you're looking for. And that's exactly because of the sounds of language are not contemplative. They're all, like strictly speaking, basically you have to learn relations. You have to memorize that like this specific combination of sounds corresponds to that type of expression. And there is no way around it. So it's always abstract. It's symbolic. Like you have to learn symbols in order to understand language. In music, there is an aspect, the kind of underlying kind of foundation of music is shared between all humans, and that is why we can appreciate music of other cultures that we have no idea about.
To close the loop on the contemplative conversation we had earlier, that makes me think more that music is not contemplative. Because again, you're not contemplating it.
What I'm talking about it is that you some sort of like as though meditate over certain aspects of music. You kind of like look at them per se. You're not connecting it like as a sign to something else, but more like kind of appreciating it per se.
I agree. So what you're saying is it's more automated. It's more automatic to us as humans, which to me is not contemplative. Is what I'm saying. Like you're not, because contemplative to me is like a secondary process, right? If you
wouldn't you would say like if you meditate, like when you meditate, are you contemplative or not?
Well, I don't meditate, but
but it's kind of relaxed. You don't make any
you make a sound, and to me, that's the opposite of contemplating, because my understanding, and I have meditated before, tried it, and it seems like the purpose is to turn your brain off and to kind of shut down things of your brain to focus in the immediate moment in order to, reset the mind or something, which I think is great. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But to me, again, contemplative to me is a very active process. So it's very much like, okay, I just read this poem by William Wordsworth of 2 April Mornings, and it's a poem I really like. It's one of his Matthew poems of conversations between him and this older gentleman, Matthew, and or the fountain, and they're talking about this fountain, this memory that Matthew had years ago. And then I'm thinking about it afterwards. So it's like there's the moment where I'm appreciating the sound. So like I always say on this channel that poetry is not meant to be read. Yes. It's meant to be reread, right? Because the idea is when you're first hearing it, the first couple times, you're trying to just hear and appreciate the sound with some of the meaning. Then afterwards, you could think about the meaning more. And then the meaning will strike you harder with the combination of the sound as you go through it. But again, the meaning comes as a contemplative secondary, like a post reading process.
No, I would say
versus
that,
music is not like that for me.
The reason why like poetry like also can be contemplated over is because it has musicality. The musical aspects of poetry are basically making you contemplate it. Otherwise, like I don't think you would be able to do that, because not only it is like art of rereading poetry, but it is also the art of rereading it aloud.
Well, that's what I said. Yeah, so I'm saying like reading it aloud in order, like to hear the
and
sound.
Listening to the sound of voice, to the intonation of the voice.
But that's why the rereading part is the contemplative part. So I don't re-listen to music. I mean, I do, but like that's not the point of the music. To me, the music is, like you said, automatic. So in my mind, there's music is an automatic. Like you're saying, there's certain things that just hits me. It makes me sad because the music makes me sad. The way, the tone of it, all the melody, everything is just, it's certain rhythms that are making me sad versus making me angry or pumped up. Like when I'm in the gym, I like some heavy stuff, like I get all pumped up, right? Because you want music that's like rock and roll and heavy metal or hardcore rap or something like that, because it's really getting you pumped up. I'm not contemplating that, is what I'm saying. So. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure we loop that up. So I think we are talking about two different types of contemplation. You have a different, maybe specific formulation of it.
Basically, what I meant is like as though you're living through certain experience repeatedly, like in your mind, like after you like listen to a piece of music. You kind
so
of
that
like,
sounds contemplative.
Yeah. Well, that's like very.
So that doesn't happen to me though.
It doesn't. Or maybe you just like your listening mode like is different, or the kind of music that you are listening is different, because not all music is created for that purpose. For instance, like hard rock music is not like designed like for contemplation.
Yeah.
Simply.
So when you're listening to
Japanese traditional music like gagaku, for instance, it is very poetic.
Poetic in the sense of using words?
It can use words, yeah, but like itself, it kind of presents moods, like as though, and like a listener is supposed to appreciate change of those moods, and then how those moods are kind of applying, like in which context.
Is what you're saying that there's a training thing here?
Yeah, and that leads us to a second, what do you call, aspect of music that it contains. Because there is this biological foundation of it that is shared by everybody. But then, like in languages, also there is a learned aspect too, based on conventions. And this originates from music genres. Because like in every music cultures, like you have like certain typical applications of music. Like most common examples, for instance, like mother lulling a child to sleep.
Sure.
That's like one kind of genre. As opposed to, for instance, a genre for all men to march at war. Like, it's a totally different application. And then they're going to cultivate totally different rhythms, meters, melodies, like and methods of arranging like all parts together.
But how is that contemplative? Again, it's not like you said something that to me sounded contemplative, and then again, this stuff you're saying now is just automatic. So I hear.
The second part is not automatic; it has to be learned. Like, so you have to live on that culture and to observe how people are using their music.
Wait. But that seems to contradict what you said earlier, unless I'm misunderstanding something. Okay. So is music, like, are certain sounds, do they elicit biologically, neurologically, like from birth, certain things in us, in humans? Do. Okay, that's not contemplative. That's
not contemplative. Yeah.
Okay, so where's the contemplative part?
Contemplative is coming from that learned part, the part that like depends on conventions. For instance, you have to know that in this culture there is a convention, for instance, of marching, like on up the hill. So marches are very different from marches in the country where there is like playing.
But again, so like. Okay, let's talk the
so
marching.
So then the conventions for marching are going to be different. Or for instance, you might have lots of people in one like kind of like society, and another society can be very scarce, like where basically you have nomads like by units of 2-3 people they're moving around. They simply cannot have like lots of genres of collective music.
Okay, I need some examples. So with marching. So, I think of marching like in a like in war where you have a certain beat and there's like a drummer boy, right? And that's important to keeping the pace, but also keeping your heart beating.
Yes.
If I were to, let's say you have a British soldier 200 years ago or something, and they have the little drummer boy or whatever, right? Or in the Revolutionary War, you have a, British boy like doing the drums to get people going. If you were to bring a Japanese soldier there, like with no training, just ship him out, just blindfold him and ship him out, put him on the line and say, march. Wouldn't he get it?
He'll get it, because in the march there is also a component that is biological, like the one that is like has to do with the meter.
So you're just
that it is every music it contains this foundation. You cannot find a piece of music that wouldn't contain biological
distinction
things.
between the biological functions and there is this separate where every culture has its own unique flavor to the music.
Yeah, that you have to learn to recognize and
that there's learn
and learn conventions as what is their meaning. And usually people learn it by observing how people use music and which
which
settings.
one is music?
Music is both of them.
You think it's both?
Both, yeah.
Okay. But more fundamentally, it's the base like music and like how music affects consciousness. It's the first, right? That's the biological.
It's the starting point. It's look like at the birth of a child.
So I think I was just confused. So now I have a better understanding of what you were talking about in your paper. I think when you were talking about the contemplative part of music, you were talking about the second learned part.
Yes.
Okay. Where you hear a certain kind of marching tune that gets you feeling positive about the heroism and the greatness of your nation. And so every time you hear the national anthem, you feel a swell of pride.
Yes.
That's learned.
Yeah.
Okay. So I agree with that. That I was just confused. Sorry to dwell.
And an example, for instance, of different conventions, even within the same genre application. Take marches, because not all marches are military. You have also circus marches.
Sure.
You have like marches like in what we call productions, like comic productions, like vaudeville, for instance, so like comedies, like, and they use different time signatures, for instance. Like that's like one of like a metric and rhythmic difference. They might also use different types of melodies, like for instance, like in relation to leaps or in relation to like specific rhythms, like for instance, punctured rhythm as opposed to straight, like punctured, like dun ta dun ta dun ta dun ta, as opposed to ta 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 ta. Or for instance, in say Irish music, in Scottish. Like you often use like the reverse puncture, which is ta-da, ta-ta, ta-da, ta-ta. So these are little like features that if you're familiar with the conventions of different cultures, you'll recognize them. And then in that way, you'd recognize, for instance, that, oh, this is, for instance, like, I don't know, Scotland Yard, like whatever march, like that they use like with this, what do you call, bagpipes, for instance, as opposed to you can have like marches that are very odd, like for instance Georgian traditional music with the very steep mountains, like you cannot march and you cannot have like lots of people, so their marches sound very different. They sound like as though they're elevating in pitch and they're becoming slower, a little bit slower as it progresses, because it's hard and they have to kind of make an effort. Yeah. So it's more about like straining rather than keeping like the beat, like what you call like militant. Like,
yeah, I mean, this is fine. I was just trying to wrap my head around your statement about all music is contemplative, because again, to me, because that's what the paper said. So I was just trying to understand. But you're breaking it down into two components: the biological and the other. Now, this biological neurological aspect, that's related to language as well.
Yeah.
In what you're saying. So here's a question. How might the dual heritage of language and music explain the enduring power of storytelling found in the great canonical works of literature? Can you think about that? So we've been talking, like we could talk about the Iliad, right? The Iliad, the Odyssey, and things like that. How might the two kind of explain the ways in which storytelling occurs in great literature? the duality between music and language?
Well, the biggest difference is that like language, it allows only what do you call turn taking. Like we cannot talk like on top of each other, and also even if we will start repeating the same text, both of us, like in sync, it won't work. It will sound very artificial. And so you are angry, for instance, and I'm trying to repeat exactly what you're saying in sync with you, and also trying to sound angry. Both of us won't sound angry. We will sound weird. You see what I'm saying? But in music, it is like a totally different story. Like if you have like one person, like say for instance, like angry, like singing, and if you have 100 people singing angry in unison, that's a lot stronger anger. Like everybody will perceive it as more powerful, like kind of more scary. So music, it operates by a completely different principle of what do you call it has a tendency to integrate things, whereas language has tendency to encounter kind of like as though break things into segment things, like what linguists call parsing sentences into words, parsing words into syllables, like all of that. And also when you listen to speech, you parse it, like you cut it off from other sounds, like that are like speech of somebody else, for instance. But when you listen to music, like, everything becomes integrated together. Even ancients, they like noticed that the more people kind of are engaged in production of music, the more powerful and impressive is the expression of that emotion. That's a fundamental difference between language and music, because language is also capable of expressing emotions, because it stems from the same foundation, from the same root, like scientists call it musi-language, like that hypothetical communication that probably Australopithecus, and like earliest human species, they were using too. And at that time, probably it was like more similar to animal communication. Primarily, like one member of a group like expressed like the current physical state, like to other, whether it is like for purposes of defense, like avoiding some predator, or mating maybe, or keeping territory, scaring off like a potential like another contestant or whatever.
So, but are you saying that music and language develop together?
Probably.
Okay. And then, but what is the relevance of that? Like, what is it?
Well, the relevance is that is why they share lots of like common traits. Like, for instance, they both use pitch, like intonation in your speech goes up and down, and it is meaningful. Like that's how you can hear. For instance, if somebody is certain, or if somebody is unsure or asking something.
Yeah.
In the same way, you have like what they call rhythm. Like if I start accelerating, then you perceive it as though I'm eager to get somewhere. And if I start slowing down, you feel that I like kind of like I run out of what I want to say, and like you can like take over. So there are lots of cues in language that are using exactly the same like dynamics.
So I mean, I agree with all that, obviously.
Like accent.
I 100% agree with all that. I guess I'm curious about the relevance of the investigation about the origins of these things.
Well, it's important to basically understand like what we as humans like we're defaulted for. You see, and it also defaulted like our hearing, because like experimentally it has been shown that people like start modifying messages differently based on what they know about it. If you tell them, for instance, you give them some patterns of artificial sounds, artificial signal, and you tell them that it is music, and then they start replicating it and passing it to another person, like in a chain. They start like amplifying completely different sound, what they call patterns, as opposed to if you tell them that it is speech.
Yeah.
So for some reason, like in music, they will zoom in pitch, and they'll try to regularize the pitch. So to make it like kind of like more as though it's following the same rule, and the rule is going to be like musical.
The rule is going to be musical?
Yeah, musical in the sense that, for instance, like when the voice goes up, like it means that there is more tension. If it goes down, there is more relaxation. That's more like typical.
Yeah, no, I mean,
musical phrases.
you know all the. I mean, this is like if you've ever acted, you learn different ways of intoning a line.
Yeah.
Sure.
And language, you have like so many ways like how your intonation can.
I mean, is there a lot of pushback on this as a theory? Because like what I'm trying to get at is just, to me it seems pretty obvious that language has a musicality to it, and music has a kind of way that it is understood similar to language, I guess. Even though it's not symbolic, it's more primitive in a sense. Like to me, it seems
I would call it iconic. Like that's usually. It
seems like music precedes, or musicality must precede language. Like
music is closer to animal communication than language.
Yeah, like it's just making sounds, and then language is something that develops over time.
Language, it patterns things, and then it links like certain patterns of sounds to certain meaning.
Yeah,
and like that's the only way how it works. Like the other, like of
but
course,
are
like
there pushbacks to the theory? Is what I'm saying. Like to me, that seems pretty clear, uncontroversial to me. But as a just from my own knowledge, limited knowledge based in common sense, is that I can see animals, making sounds. I heard birds today just communicating back and forth. One would chirp, chirp, chirp. Another would chirp, chirp. And so it's like, that's in animal nature, right? So if assuming we believe in evolution, which I do, or not believe, but we know it's been proven.
Yeah, accept
the truth of it. Then it makes sense that the process has to. It's like the only way it gets confusing is if someone is a believer in the 6,000 year, issue of Christ or God creating the world 6,000 years ago, and so He gave us language with the snap of His fingers because He created us. Then it gets confusing. So but to me, once you have the knowledge of evolution as the process by which we got here through that, through those mechanisms, it seems that it's pretty straightforward. To me, the lesson of what you're saying in your paper about these similarities is what I was trying to get at the beginning of our conversation, which is, to me, it's not. To me, there is a humongous difference, even if you can't yet trace in the mind, the actual neurobiology of the mind of the kid in New York who's raised on Shakespeare and Mozart and all these classical, that he has a baseline that's much more diverse and complex and superior in a sense to the kid who doesn't have that. And so it's, again, like if there is this relationship with these two things that are ingrained in us, we should want to develop that to the highest that individually as humans we can.
Yes.
And that will make us better humans, like better at the thing of being a human being. Right?
Yeah.
So that was my first point, was the non-optional, like, because I was asking about, well, the kid who's 15 and is raised on just rock, he's worse off than the kid who's raised on all the other stuff.
Well, generally, you might find some occupations for that kid, like where it wouldn't be that bad.
I'm not talking about job.
But
I'm talking about worse off as a human, qua human.
As a human, yes. Like this person will have like more difficulties dealing with other humans.
But I find it interesting because, like, even the way you address it is like he can make more money. Possibly, yes. Like, it's possible that the guy who's a rocker, who's he could get into engineering.
He can become a soldier, for instance. Then, like there are no downsides, like from not being sensitive enough.
Yeah, but this is like, to me, such a limiting view of a human being, because you're just equating them with profession. I'm talking about like what makes us human as such.
Even as potentials, like for development.
Yeah, and
fulfillment of
fulfillment, flourishing, the totality of the human being as a human. And part of that is the experience of living on this earth as in your own body, which means that there is this biological thing we have, neurobiological thing that being exposed and expanding and developing your natural understanding of the complexities that's possible in sound and language is a part of the human flourishing. I would argue that would lead to not only a better flourishing human, but a more productive human in many ways, or at least it wouldn't hurt, but it could definitely lead to, better engineers.
Yeah.
And in the sense of just the ability to, one of the problems engineers tend to have is an inability to understand why people are so stupid. And like why people don't get what they are creating. Like I created something brilliant, right? And there's like examples of this in Steve Jobs' biography with not Steve Jobs himself. Steve Jobs, I think, was incredibly empathetic. Actually, he's drawn as an asshole, but he understood what people wanted deeper than anybody. That's why he was so brilliant. But someone like Steve Wozniak was just focused on the thing itself, had no idea that people wouldn't want to put together. That they would not be interested in putting together the board and the keyboard, and that they, doing it themselves, that they would want a complete unit of a computer. Right. So the first thing that he sold, right, I don't know if you know this, was just a computer board. And then because at the time it was like, that was hobbyists would take that computer board, put it together with the keyboard, with the monitor, they would build it. But it's like, people don't want to do that. Steve Jobs figured that out for Apple II. And so that's what they did for Apple II. That was a big deal for them, and they made a lot of money from that. My point is that if the engineer had more of that experience and thoughtfulness, they'd be better engineers.
Yeah, I agree. It's like an ideal case scenario, a person who has like more diverse, like what do you call, repertoire of emotions, is going to be like, is going to enjoy like richer life and has great potentials in kind of learning something or something new, and kind of like getting whatever of his mission, like amongst other people, like fulfilled. It's greater chances, like, and music definitely can play a very big part, substantial part into it. And from that point of view, it is very sad that in modern world, both what do you call artistic music, like classical, Western classical tradition, it went down the drain, like as a result of the Second World War, like all this hit by this virus of modernism, like, and like basically became like it not only is it lost like all national traits and all genre traits, like which turned it into meaningless. Basically, assortment.
Like music itself became meaningless.
Yeah, completely.
Well, classical.
It became classical music. A typical. It's impossible. Like I myself, I write music that is meaningful, and I struggle like to get it performed like anywhere, because like everything is like overfilled like with donations, like all sorts of like grants, like that they all go like towards basically development of like what they think. The gatekeepers who have like access and who decide like who is going to be funded, who is not going to be funded.
Sure.
They basically look at
from the government.
Yeah, either like by social principles, like it's like a female composer, like it was underrepresented.
Yeah, but there's still very popular music in movies.
Still, but it is like going down. Like movie music today is not as expressive as it used to be. Like say, for instance, in the 1980s, and in the 1980s it is not as expressive as in the 1940s. Like.
Well, I guess I'm just saying, like, there's an issue of a market. There's not a market for, I don't think there's a market for great literature today. There's just no market for it. There's a market for popular detective fiction and mystery thrillers and certain kinds of fantasy, erotica fantasy even, I think is really popular now. So there are markets out there, but they're not, there doesn't seem to be a great market for great literature and great symphonies as much as there used to, in great paintings like there used to be. But it seems like again, it's gone into movies and television, like the talent in that sense, to the degree that it exists, goes into those realms.
Well, there are two sets of problems. Like one you can call professional, and another is kind of like amateur, because popular music, like what you're talking about, like popular films, for instance, or popular literature too, they're on the same page. They are some sort of as though made by an average Joe, like because like the kind of like the image that they kind of like try to project that, like, for instance, this is like a popular song, like anybody could have invented it. Like your neighbor could have invented it, like in the garage, like whatever. So you can do it, like you can like learn how to play guitar and sing like that. As opposed to, say, if it's an orchestral like performance or like some lead, like where there's a singer who spent like, I don't know, like 10 years like trying to put like voice like bel canto in the right way and like doing everything appropriately. So from that point of view, there's like there's a position between
guitarists put like
how it should be and anything goes, basically.
But guitarists put like 10 years into getting great at guitar, being a guitarist.
Well, electric guitar, like if you're talking about like rock music, like it's a different thing. It's closer to classical music from that point of view. Yeah, because like some
popular classical music,
some genres, they were like in between. Like, say, for instance, jazz is in between. Like it's kind of like there are big parts of jazz, like they're like extracting like basically syntax of classical music.
Yeah,
like the chords,
and they're popularizing it.
Yeah, popularizing it. At least it used to be like that, and then they had their own problem. Like
so, how do you get away from the view of it's pretentious what we're talking about right now?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you get away from that view? Like, what's your argument?
So we're talking about professional now. Like, if you have, like,
I'm talking about like, so you're saying, you're a composer, you're having difficulties getting your music out into the world because it's more symphonic, it's more complexity of melodies and rhythms and things like that, and it's got a whole orchestra that you're dealing with versus just rock bands and ska bands and emo band, whatever. Like there's certain configurations of there's a drummer and music, and maybe you could play around with like what instruments are there to some degree, but it's pretty basic in what you do in that realm.
I wouldn't say like that it's necessarily limited, because you have like also in rock music progressive rock, like such bands as like Yes, for instance, or Emerson, Lake and Palmer, like which.
But so that's my point.
They were
like,
making
why not
things like they were closer to symphony. Like,
but I'm asking you, why don't you make that kind of music?
Oh, like them?
Yes, because that's where there is a market.
Oh, I'm not sure.
Is it just being pretentious to try to write this, more this other stuff? Is what I'm talking about.
Well, first of all, because like what they were doing, it was also limited. It still was rock music. So as such, like it didn't, like, for instance, they didn't have like lullabies. Like there is no place for lullabies in their music. Like,
well, but if you created a lullaby, you could get successful lullabies. There are lullabies out there. This whole kind. I'm just trying to get
the problem is like who's going to produce it? Who's going?
What I'm interested in is like, because I hear this all the time in literature, trying to get people to read classic literature, great Don Quixote or something like that. It's just, again, it's always the issue of like, what's the point? Like I get art from other places, from movies, from television, from music. So who cares? So like nobody is. So in the world we live in this post, for instance, with poetry, let's take it as an example, where we don't have poetry anymore. We don't really have verse anymore like we used to, where everybody had verse in their life. I don't care if you were a math whiz or if you were a painter or a poet, everyone had verse in their life a lot. Now they don't, really. So I'm just trying to get at the idea of like, what does it matter? In the sense of today, people get artistic experiences from movies, from lots of music. Like, I think people are inundated with that kind of stuff. So what's the argument to get them to read something and experience something more challenging for them?
Well, it's like any kind of like investment in skills. Like if you invest, like it will be hard in the beginning, but then you will be able to do things that you are not capable of doing now. And basically you will enjoy like more input, like more kind of like feedback. You would start like understanding conceptually like some things that you might not be understanding, or feeling things that like you are not sensitive to right now. You are going to be more diverse, like, and that should like open more horizons, like for your fantasy, for your creativity. That's basically.
I mean, that's the argument I make. It's just I always look for different ways of trying to convince people of that, because I always come up with this massive wall, even in really successful, really smart people, of just not wanting to do it. And I just wonder if, okay, the only thing is to get it when they're young, but the problem is there are very few people who are good at teaching it.
Yes.
Like most teachers ruin it for life for everybody. And in literature, in poetry, in music, and all of that stuff. Even music teachers, I think, often ruin the enjoyment and the potential growth possible from the arts. And so it's like this horrible doom loop that we're in, where I'm part of the mission of Troubadour is to get out of that. So try to help people have great first experiences with literature, literary art in particular, but all art really. So that's like part of my mission. But it's a really big challenge in the sense that when you talk to people, because again, even when I mentioned this to you, I just have to point this out. Even when I talked about the two kids, the 15-year-old rocker and the 15-year-old Mozart lover, you were like, well, the other kid, like your mind went immediately to job. But I asked which one was better. Right. And I don't mean to like point,
better is always like in relation to something. So that is why I started talking about jobs.
I'm picking on you in a sense. I am picking on you in a sense just because I want to emphasize how even you with your love of this, your mind automatically went there. And I think that's where everyone's mind goes to. That's where parents' minds go to. They don't think about which one's going to enjoy this life better. I think the Mozart lover is going to enjoy the life of the existence on this earth more than the kid who's in the rocker and who's stuck in the rocker realm, unless we can break him out of that and have him read classic works of art, have him go to symphonies, have him, read and study and enjoy a Shakespeare play, which does take work. But so many people just push back about that so hard. And, part of it is this idea that I've been ranting about.
Here probably the best comparison would be like how I was raised and like my experience when I left. Because in Soviet Union there was like education.
How many ballets did you see growing up? Like every weekend or something, right?
In Moscow alone there were like over 70 theaters. Like where you could choose like every
professional
evening.
Theaters.
Yeah, professional theaters, like on very high level performance. And you could choose like between like say 20 different shows, like basically every single night.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the kind of world I was trying to pull out of you to talk about a little bit. It's just we're missing it, but it's a catch-22. But go ahead.
You had like modern poets, like living poets, like Evgeny Yevtushenko.
In America or in Russia?
In Russia, like in Soviet Union. Like he would have like, for instance, like an evening, like where he would recite his poetry. It would be full house.
Yeah.
Like and people would be standing outside, like trying to get in. Not enough places. And then they would have recordings of it, and then they would exchange those tapes like with each other. Like, oh, have you heard this one? Have you heard that one? And it would be like lots of conversations about it, discussions. And like such like poets, like actors, they were like favorites basically.
And people would sit around and talk about the meaning of it, how it affected them. The intellectual discussions are going to be more
but the reason it was there, it was because like from kindergarten basically everything was turned towards arts. Like in kindergarten already you had like a state program that was like unified and created by experts like in the field, like in pedagogy and in, say, for instance, if it is a program in literature, then there would be also experts in poetry.
Were you personally, when you were in like what we call grammar school, so age 5, 6, 7, 8 years old?
I was surrounded by poems.
Were you reading?
I myself was writing poems when I was 7 years old.
But hold on, was it lullaby level poems or were they adult poems? Like
more like attempts of doing adult.
But so you were reading really complex Russian poetry?
Well,
at 6 years old.
No, at 6 years old, like it was like more children poets, but then they had like big poems. I mean, like it's not like limerick, but it could be like, for instance, with chapters.
The poem.
Even so poem would be like a novel basically.
So you were reading the equivalent of like the Iliad in Russian.
No, not that complex. It would be adapted for children, like for instance,
we do that
Tchaikovsky,
Tchaikovsky for kids.
Tchaikovsky, yeah. Tchaikovsky, yeah.
Well, that's a poet.
Yeah, he was a poet, and then he was.
So it's not Tchaikovsky.
No, it's not the composer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Tchaikovsky.
Yeah, he was like active in 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and he specialized in writing long poems like for children.
Yeah, but I mean, so I'm just trying to
and they were known by everyone, every kid, like basically.
Yeah, but the everyone thing doesn't matter to me. The thing that matters to me is the exposure to great art.
Iliad and Homer was studied like in the 5th grade, like in
so that's what I'm trying to get
school.
At. Yeah,
every single school.
How did you? What like was it? It was written in Russian.
Yes, it was translated. Into
Was it
Russian.
in verse?
Yes.
Was it the entirety of the Iliad?
Yes.
Okay, so that's my point. Okay, thank you. Yeah. That's what I was trying to get at. Is like, so we definitely have fiction books that kids in America read. They clearly listen to music. Sometimes they're exposed a little bit to paintings, but I don't think they're really exposed. I don't remember much painting in my education in school. So we get some of this, but very limited. But when it's given to us, like literature at a young age, it's usually at like a really, what I would call like dumbed down version. Like it's not the actual, or it's a retelling, it's a reimagining.
No, nothing was adapted.
Yeah, like it was translated, but at the level that a kid could read it, or maybe not.
It's called adaptation.
Well, or
adaptation is like when the translator is substituting like certain like words and sentences, trying to simplify them.
Yeah, but I mean, if you translate it, you have to adapt because you're to the language. If you're going,
adaptation for children is a little bit different. They just like try to avoid complex words, for instance.
Yeah.
Or
that's what I'm saying. So they have a market for kids, and they're just like, it's for a kid's age.
Many of the stories that, for instance, like Charles Perrault, like that.
The detective.
Charles Perrault. No. It's like a famous French writer, like who wrote like a very famous about like the cat.
Yeah. I remember him. I've read him. Yeah.
If you read the original, it's a very complex book.
Yeah.
So what is published in all languages is usually adapted.
Yeah.
Because it's actually more like something like Don Quixote's, like of that sort, kind of. It's sophisticated language.
Because again, like to me, the issue is why do we lose this robustness of the culture at large in America and in the West broadly, but specifically in America? And
it's very American specifically. And I think that the reason for it is the idea of specialization. The idea that like in order to become successful in something, you have to kind of focus, like put aside like all detractors, and then just like go for something like one thing that would make the biggest difference. That's what is happening. In Soviet Union, it was a total opposite. Like the idea of education was encyclopedic. So they thought like every child has to kind of try a little bit like of every existing science. That is why basically in the curriculum of the middle school even, basically you had like all sciences like botany, zoology, anatomy, like law, like you name it.
That seems like too much, but yeah.
But that was the whole idea, and to make each citizen of the country know it, because it was a law. At least like when I was like young, unless you graduated and had a diploma that you finished like 8 years of education, where you would, again, that would include like chemistry, organic chemistry, whatever. Yeah. Like, unless you have that like certificate, you won't be able to get a job like anywhere, like even like as a porter. Like, so that was the idea, the philosophy behind like
part
adopting
of because
this.
They're just looking down on those people, in a sense.
Why? No, in contrary, they wanted like to take like people like porters or workers and to kind of make them study so that they would increase like their education. That was the idea, the philosophy of communist, what do you call people who kind of started this whole like reform, educational reform.
Yeah.
To make it like really full. They were sincere. They were not like pretending.
I know. Yeah, they were not pretending.
Yeah,
I get it.
So they tried like to take every person like, and again to bring it to even those nations that were like conducting completely different like nomadic lifestyle. For instance, like in Siberia, like there were lots of indigenous people.
Sure.
It's like Australian Aborigines. And communists, they basically like created a heroic effort like to build schools over there, to educate them in all sciences, to incorporate them into life, to enable them like prospective like roads, like as to become an engineer, for instance, or whatever. Yeah. So that they wouldn't be like just hunters like somewhere like in taiga or whatever. So that was the philosophy, like how they started the whole thing. Then, of course, like how it was administered, and in order to like make it happen, they brought like specialists in every field so that they would collaborate, creating like textbooks and courses of education in every field. And literature was part of it, and poetry was part of literature, definitely. Drawing was like probably less developed, like as opposed to music. Music was very developed. In fact, Soviet system, I don't know if you heard, like Kabalevsky system. Kabalevsky was like one of those like people who created like a method of presenting music through narratives, like to all children, through listening to some music and then discussing it, like what it expresses, and then based on that teaching children to recognize expressive elements in music. Mm-hmm. And it was extremely successful. Yeah. Like probably like, I don't know, like something like 70-80% of people who studied in general school using this method, like they basically became constant concert goers, like concert goers, yeah, or even musicians themselves.
Yeah,
literally like in millions. Like and it was the system was like set in such way that basically any teacher could have reproduced it. That's what America was missing, in my opinion. That they didn't get the figure like Kabalevsky. It all kind of went into either choir singing, or kind of like more practical, or some sort of like history of music or whatever. And again, part of it probably had to do with the musicology, because musicology was understood in Soviet Union very differently than in America. Soviet musicology understood the ideal of music was scientific, that music should be studied in the same way how language is studied.
Yes,
so study the material from which is very materialistic. Mm-hmm. Study like what are the building blocks like for that thing, then how those building blocks become meaningful. And how the author kind of arranges like those blocks in order to convey like some idea. So it was very constructive. It was very typical. Constructivism was very typical very characteristic for Russian study of language and of study of music too. And another feature is it was unity, very Russian. Russian, I mean, like going back to 19th century, starting from Lobachevsky. It was unity of humanities and what do you call concise sciences. Lobachevsky himself was a mathematician, and he also was teaching music too. And he was like the first person who put a postulate that like basically in order even for advanced education, like the ideal case if you have like training in both in sciences and in arts. And the same like movement was from biology. Like Pavlov, Ivan Pavlov, his assistant Samoilov became like a professor of music, although he was a biologist by education. And was basically teaching harmony, history of music, things like that.
Yeah.
So this tradition,
I already understand the idea that Russia has this tradition of this.
Now it's
kind of getting away from it. No, as is the world, I think, in a lot of ways, because there's not as much of a market or interest in it. But yeah, I mean, all that, like, obviously there's I mean, to me, the other issue is that those people, they existed in Russia, they existed in all over the world. That to me does not explain why it stopped in the West and in America so much, because those were possible here. Teaching and learning that way was possible in America. Just we chose not to. And the question is why, but that's, I think, another podcast. But the, to me, again, the interesting thing is the value that these, things have in our lives, and how can we get them back? That's more interesting. I thought we could have a couple questions, but we're running on time. I think we've been going for a while. Let's talk about, as an ending thing, maybe this, well, actually, I'm trying to think of what direction to end this in, because it went in an interesting direction of, and I hope people get something out of the, arguments about the value of these finer arts. That's how I think of it. Like the value of it, even if you don't see yourself as that kind of person. Yeah, I have all these questions. Well, here's one we can talk about that I've been thinking about. And I think you've touched on this a little bit, but it might be interesting to bring it out. So you use an example of a 3-year-old in the paper, right? And you say that they struggle to construct their own sentences, but can easily invent songs. That's the, I think, quote from the page, that they can invent songs. So one, do you see that as evidence of fundamentally distinct cognitive processes between the two, for language and music, right? And then are children truly inventing new musical expressions, or are they just reworking or reparroting? So it's like the different, because I think of it as more mimetic, right? That's where my coming from with art is that there's a kind of natural mimicking that we do as kids. That's how we get the training you're talking about with lullabies. And I've seen this myself with kids. They'll pick up a tune and they'll just like go with it over and over again. And it drives me crazy. Sometimes they'll just repeat it. But you talked about it being invented. I was just curious, from the 3-year-old, are the 3-year-olds inventing it? They're not inventing something.
They do. They experiment with sounds. You're right.
Experiment with sounds.
They hear some blocks, how somebody is using their mouth, for instance, to articulate something, and then the next thing they would start repeating it themselves and saying what will happen if, for instance, I make it longer, or if I make it high in pitch or lower. So it's unpredictable what is going to be the result. It is possible that they will invent something that didn't exist there before, a new configuration.
But it's still fundamentally repetitive or mimetic.
It is repetitive, but in relation to themselves. This process is called babbling.
Sure.
And it starts in a way that is hard to tell whether it is musical or speech. Because they just would, for instance, it could be a phoneme, for instance, and then they would just say in variety of ways, for instance.
Yeah.
And then you cannot say, are they singing or are they trying to kind of as though speak in a way. And then it separates, because the difference is that when they babble musically, it's always solitary experience. They're entertaining themselves. That's a form of play. It's with a ball or with something that is next to them. They also, by playing with the ball, they learn what their fingers can do, what kind of texture the ball has, what configuration does it allow, how you can manipulate it.
So
the same thing with sound.
Yeah, so they're playing with sound, for sure.
Exactly.
I mean,
it's ludic, what they call it.
Sure, I get that. I guess I'm just trying to get. Okay, so that. This is something you quoted, or I'm taking from the paper. I was trying to understand the paper. Okay. So you're saying that it's just the playfulness.
Yes.
I think, not the invention. When I think of invention, I think of something completely new. Even if you take different things and you combine them together, it's still a new thing. But they're not really. It's new to them. So it's new to the 3-year-old. The way that they can make sounds is.
What we tried to say in this article is because you can distinguish with children whether they're imitating some target, because they can imitate a specific word. For instance, they know the name of their father and how people address, and then they try to repeat it.
Yeah.
That's one thing. But it's a completely different thing when they start making their own words. And that's how usually children start. Like they can invent, like, for instance, a word for rain or for sun or for anything else that is in the environment. And they might even repeat it, like, for a number of days. The same thing with melodies that they themselves can generate. Wouldn't be like a prototype of a nursery that their mother sings to them. It would be like their own play with sounds. And then they will remember their favorite pattern of play, and tomorrow we'll repeat it again and modify a little bit. So, like, within a whole week, you would recognize, like, there were people who were actually recording all of this and then analyzing. And then they could see that there is, like, a certain consistency of them. But over a period of a month, they might drop it. And eventually, like after a year or so, they replace, like, all of this, their own personal kind of inventions with conventional, like, words or conventional melodies, like, from.
But this all just seems to fall under playing.
Yeah, in the beginning it is fully play, like, and it's unpredictable. Yeah. And the beauty for them is exactly unpredictability. It's open end.
Yeah, it's all new, and it's just it's the newness of it. Mm-hmm. Everything's new, so that's exciting, of course. Mm-hmm. And we feel that today as we go older. It's just there's less things that are new to us, or it seems that way.
Yeah,
it's not really true. There's probably still less things than a 3-year-old, but there's still plenty of new things in the world.
Yeah, but children are a lot more curious than adults, and they can also even risk, like, their health or, like, whatever.
Sure.
Like,
well, they don't know. They don't think about that long.
Yeah, exactly.
They don't have those.
This attraction is the main thing.
Yeah.
To them.
So, any other, there's so many different things to approach with this, but any final thoughts you have on the relationship between language and music and our consciousness? That we haven't addressed.
Well, there's so many, like, things that
we
could have talked, like, very easily, like another conversation dedicated.
So I don't know how deep we want to get into some, because it's already been quite a while, an interesting conversation, but there's just so what I'm interested in is how this relates to us as non-academics and why so the only thing I can come up with is the value of this is universal, and it's incumbent upon us to train ourselves and to get better, because it's training in the human tool that makes us human. It's training in the stuff we're born with to make us enjoy and experience those better improvements over time. And that's why we should be exposing ourselves to new kinds of music and art and painting and literature.
Yeah, basically they all, like, I would leave, like, painting, like, a little bit aside, because
you think that's different?
It's not like, first of all, it's not a universal trait of humans, like, because maybe fine art, like, there are, like, some cultures, like, where you don't have fine art at all.
But everybody, you're saying, when I say painting, I mean in the broad, pictorial, yes, that's what I mean.
It's not universal. Like, you cannot say that this is a universal trait of humans as a species.
That they draw? There's humans that don't draw?
There are some cultures where there is no, like, pictorial representation. In fact, like, there were even experiments of, like, trying to teach, like, some of ethnicities in Siberia, like, of pictorial representation, and they couldn't do it. Like, for instance, like, there was a group of scientists who approached Nenets people. It's like a Taimyr peninsula is utmost north, one of the most northern territories, where basically people live on isolated groups of 2-3 people, and then they hunt. Like, so they asked the indigenous people to draw different geometric what we call sculptures. So there was, like, a sculpture of a circle, for instance, like a ball, and a sculpture of triangle, and
they couldn't do it.
They couldn't. No, they couldn't.
I want to see more about that.
I can send you, like, a paper with a description. It's in English, actually.
I just find it really hard to believe that there's
it has pictures and descriptions as what went wrong, because they would like start depicting it, like for instance line by line, and then discover that, oh no, that's wrong, and then they'll cross it and
but
then
that seems
redo it.
Different. I'd still want to look at that, because that seems very different than if you went back to their village. They don't have any drawings anywhere. They don't draw in the sand. They don't do cave painting style. Like, I just find that hard.
Well, so some of them, they don't have decorative art. Like some of them, they cannot read maps. Like, and they couldn't be taught.
That's different. Again, that's different. I'm saying like, yeah, and I'm not even saying decorative. I'm saying more advanced than decorative.
We'll say, like, if we're talking about realistic representation of reality.
Well, no, just any. It doesn't. I don't. Whatever you mean by realistic. I just mean like, they can.
By realistic, I mean like you see a contour of something and then you reproduce it pictorially.
Yeah, I would need to see that they had none of that in their village. That they had no little figurines of like a person or of an animal that they hunted. That was part of, or like. I just cannot.
Some of them, they have like only ornamental kind of like lines, like that you wouldn't even like identify. They don't look like anything.
Yes.
So, for instance, they would make like parallel lines or crosses.
Yes, no, again, I'm not
like
saying that.
Like
that's more primitive. I'm saying.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe there's some cultures that are so primitive they haven't gotten there yet.
Maybe.
But I'd be curious.
But then the question is like, why and like what?
But to me, that's another. Again, I would want to look into that deeper, but there is a progression from, and we could, like, this book goes into it a little bit. There's books that go into anthropology where you can go all the way back. You could see with these people, there's a development of how they go from just some decorative geometric, like lines on a whatever on or like little, like this, and that's it, just like this over and over and over again. They don't have the representational. So I'm just going like a diagonal line or something. They don't have, the representational art that we're talking about. But everywhere I've ever looked in any region, they have some kind of cave art, and then that develops into little figurines and other things of representing something in reality, of representational art. So to find cultures that don't have that.
There are cultures that don't have.
Yeah, so that means
only symbolic art, like crosses, for instance, or kind of like check marks or incisions.
But then that's just because they haven't developed into that next stage for whatever reason.
It could be that it's just like not important for them, like in their culture. Like that's what I'm saying. It's not universal.
Sorry, I'd have to look into that. They just don't think it's important. That's not sufficient.
Well, I don't know. Like it can vary, like from culture to culture.
Yeah, but my claim is, so if that's true, I'd want to have a lot of evidence, because that would smash my whole theory of art. That it's universal. It's
okay, I will send
so I'd have to know what's really going on there, because I think of the art as the human, is in the sense of, if all cultures, my contention is the same thing with music, is all cultures develop a music.
Yeah, with music and with language, they're considered to be traits.
But I see those going hand in hand with art, so I'd have to. So I'm not saying advanced representation, but just like they draw or they create something that's representative. And if they don't, so again, like I said, you could go far enough back before representational art. So there is a period of humanity that's primitive enough that they only have the geometrical designs.
You mean like colored beads or things like that?
No. Are you hearing what I'm saying? Wait, what'd you say?
Colored beads, for instance. Like these are like one of the first archaeological finds that like archaeologists claim that they're...
I'm just, look, all I'm saying is they could go like, they have a hut, or we have some tool that they had, and we could see that they went like this on it. And that's a decorative non-representation. So every culture, if you go back far enough, they all, like, everyone has that. That's the first echoes.
Prints like of palms, like on like walls.
I think that's
not.
I think that's different, because animals could do that. I mean, like, there's some where it's like they signed it. I'm talking about like something deeper. So there's a desire to like, I have this tool. Let me, etch out this on it, etch out like a little lines across it. Like, these Indians put like 3 little lines across the middle.
So decorative art, basically.
That's what I'm saying. Yes, that's going all the way back.
Oh, okay.
There's a period, so my view is every human society has that.
Decorative art, yes, I would agree.
And then they developed representational
But about representational art, like it's a whole different story.
Yeah, it's a whole different story. That's the next step on the way to like a written language, for instance. Now, are there societies today that don't have written languages? Yes, there's still a few. But I'm just saying that society you're talking about would have to be pre-representational, meaning that it's basically Neanderthal, like it's like not. No, I know it's not really.
I mean, like mentally speaking, I mean, like they learn, for instance, how to ride a boat, like a motorboat, for instance. They can operate like electrical devices. Like, I mean. So they're not stupid, in other words. They're smart, and they can learn. If you take them from their environment and put like in a city, so that like their children grow in the city, well, you'd have to, they're indistinguishable from.
No, I'm sorry, you're not listening to what I'm saying. I'm sorry, you're not understanding what I'm saying. I agree, they're humans, but their society hasn't developed to that point. So yes, if you took an infant, a newborn from the most primitive society in the world, and you brought them to New York City and trained them as a New Yorker, they would be like any other New Yorker.
Yes.
So I'm just saying that you're saying that there's an isolated society that hasn't gotten to the point where they can represent
representational art. Yes.
Art.
They just like, for whatever reason. In their case, I think it's simply because most of the time it's bloody cold over there, and like it's just like hard to, technically speaking.
But that would mean that whole society is pre-written language, and they're so they're just super primitive. Like there's those islands. I can't remember the islands where there's really primitive people.
Maybe Papua New Guinea.
Yeah. Thank you. Where it's they are cannibals. They have like all
until like 1920s or 30s.
Yeah. So sure, that exists, but that's what you're saying. These people are
kind of. Yeah. They're called indigenous. Like. But the word primitive is today not used.
Well, whatever. But I'm just saying like that's a different point than what I'm making about the universality of art. So I
always understood like if you say like something universal, then it means that it is present in all cultures, in all existing cultures.
No, I don't think so. Not necessarily. It's possible. Like you have the capability to write as a human, like we just said. If you learn so we have a conceptual faculty that's universal to all humans. But if I were to put a child, that same New Guinea, Papuan or whatever baby, in a room and just kind of feed it and not give it any language, not teach it how to write, not teach it how to represent, not show it pictures, nothing. It's not going to develop its natural universal capacity to do that.
You're talking about like feral children, like Mowgli.
Yes, but what I'm saying is but it's still universal that they have a conceptual faculty as a human, even though that child did not develop it.
Oh, I see.
So what I'm saying is like those humans, so like if you went to that village that doesn't have it, you can teach them how to represent art.
Yeah, you could, technically speaking.
That's what I'm saying, yeah. So it's that doesn't change my theory about the universality of art.
But by that talking, it's very hard to draw like a distinction. Like if you take chimpanzees, they also can be taught like to recognize words.
Sure.
And some of them like even can recognize like written words or like even themselves like say something like as though like.
I mean, I don't know that much about the animals' consciousness in that realm, but again, that just shows me how deep it is. Yes, it's there.
But then, like, if that's the case, like, but then you cannot say that like language is part of like characteristics of chimpanzee, because they themselves they don't develop it.
No, I know.
They can be taught, but then they themselves they don't develop it.
Yes, I know.
And they don't retain it. Like, say, for instance, if you teach children of that,
again, it's mimetic. It's monkey see, monkey do.
Yeah, kind of. Like,
But the difference.
One generation.
The difference is that the New Guineans can develop. They have the capacity to develop it, or they can learn or be taught. That like how to do it on their own and do new inventive things because they have a conceptual faculty. It's just not trained, and why it's not trained is another question. But it's just not trained. That's the only situation. But they have the conceptual faculty to do that.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'd still be curious about this non-representational art society. Because I know there's primitive,
by Goncharov.
the ideas of primitive people, I know that they exist, but the issue is that they can do this thing.
Oh, he was describing exactly like their attempts to reproduce it and where they would typically stop and what would be the cause like for their dissatisfaction. Like they would decide like to drop, like that it didn't go like well.
Yeah, I guess I don't know what that proves.
Well, it just like proves the conventionality of painting.
The what? Conventionality?
Conventionality, yeah. You have to be taught. You have to learn it. You have to see somebody else doing it in order to kind of do it yourself.
Well, yeah. No, I mean, yes.
Well, the same goes like to...
So, yes,
to
of course
like,
there's techniques in it. But
those kids, for instance, who don't know how to learn, they were experimentally shown that they learn a lot better and faster, like how to draw, for instance, an object by looking how somebody else is drawing like that object, rather than themselves like trying to draw it.
Yeah, I don't understand what we're arguing about. Because I agree with that. The idea that you need to be trained in art.
Well, we're arguing like about like whether something is cultural or natural. So if it is cultural, it has to be learned. If it is natural, it doesn't have to be learned. It kind of like a person can
I guess
develop
in my mind, there's
themselves.
no difference. Cultural is natural in the sense. It's a natural byproduct of human creation, which is part of our conceptual faculty and what we do naturally. So it's just who we are. Now, in different cultures, will do it differently because of their environments, because of their, what they see and think and talk about, for sure. But again, I think it's a universal capacity that every human has. And it's just a matter of how and why they develop it. And that's another situation. But yeah, I mean, I don't doubt that there are cultures that haven't developed for whatever reason that still exists in the world. I know when the British went into the Middle East to develop oil, they had to teach the people how to use a wheelbarrow. They had to teach certain people how to use a wheelbarrow. They'd never seen anything like that before.
Yeah, a wheel, for instance, like it was not known. And
yeah, I mean, so there's the idea that certain cultures don't develop or certain cultures develop faster than others is very true. And I don't have any doubts about that. You could see that, again, in anthropological studies. You could see, like, I remember, I've used this example before, I think we should end on this. We're approaching a long time.
Okay.
But I remember I went to, so there's the geometric horse that you could see developed in Greece, like, I think 1500 BC or something like that. It's just a simple 4 legs, like a little snout.
Oh, you mean like a sculpture?
Yeah, yeah. And it's like a geometrical shape. It's very simple design, right? And I remember I remember reading that and I was studying it in college and I was just new to it all. And then I went to a museum somewhere and I saw it. I was like, oh, a Greek. And then I looked at it and it said something like 1370 AD. I was like, AD, what's going on? And then it was like Aztec or something like that. And it was the same exact design, same exact thing. And what that taught me, and we can't talk about this today because it's multiculturalism, is that cultures develop at different levels. So like the Greeks were way more advanced, by 500 BC than the people around the Aztec cultures were by 1300 AD. And, in the arts and sciences and philosophy and everything like that. So that is true. So the idea that there's a spread or a difference in how fast a society develops, intellectually, artistically, things like that. Yes, 100%. So that's, to me, what's going on with this culture I don't know about, that you're talking about, where they're just not developed in that field yet. And, the idea that they wouldn't be interested in it is why they're not developed in it, because there's, for whatever reason, the culture hasn't advanced to a level where they do build that kind of thing, where they want to build that kind of artistic world.
Yeah, that's like probably, again, like Russia would be a very good source for kind of checking such theories, because they were direct attempts of like those people who were coming from European educated like parts of Russia to those like parts like Siberia, extreme north, and then they were trying to approach these people and to teach them. So unlike in other parts of the world, there were like massive examples of thousands of people who were involved into this type of attempt of education.
I still want to learn.
And then all of it was like written down. It was all documented.
Yeah. I still want to learn more because, yeah, like that would mean that that culture is 50,000 years behind other cultures. Like the first cave paintings.
Oh, that's exactly what modern anthropologists like. They hate like to deal with like such comparisons, like such talk.
Well, and you know, I'm not saying it's not possible. Like I'd want to know why and what's going on.
Well, most likely in their case,
I just want to see
the case for it is geographic, like because it's most of the time it's very cold. Even during summer, it is very cold. So that is why, like, they have to cover their hands like with something. So, and when the hands are not free, like, how can you like kind of like draw? Like, you need like fine control, like fingers. So that could be one of
send it to me.
Another reason could be scarcity of population, because like when you have like basically you deal with like 3-4 people like throughout your life, it's not very
3 or 4 people.
Yeah.
How big is this village?
Oh, they don't have villages. Like it's so bloody cold that they basically like only travel.
Isn't a village. This is just a couple people.
Yeah.
But they're living together like their whole life.
Yeah, basically like units of like 3 to 5 people.
Their whole life?
Most of time. Like occasionally they might like meet like.
That's closer to feral to me than a society.
Oh, well, like density of population is one of the key for the progress.
Sure, yeah. Well, again, that's feral. If you put a family on an island at birth or whatever, and like, or you know, like, yeah, they're not going to develop, and you just, yeah. All right, cool. Well, that's an interesting place to stop. I still want to learn about that, but that makes sense now. That's not really a society. So the idea that an individual, I don't think
you can't use. I think you still have to. What other word are you going to use instead of society?
I don't know. Like 3 individuals. I think a society needs.
No, the whole nation, the whole ethnicity, it might be like 300 people.
Oh, so there's a group. That's
like, for instance,
you said 3 or 5 people.
No. All, if you take like all people who identify themselves, for instance, as Ngana-san, like there would be like just few hundred people who speak their language,
but they don't interact with each other.
Yeah, but like they don't see like all 500 at the same time.
Ever.
Like, I don't know, like maybe in some nations, like for instance, Yakuts, they have an annual festival where kind of like anybody who is like within like a certain like radius of say 100 kilometers, they would like come together and gather. So there you can have like annual gatherings of few hundred people. It's possible. But like smaller nations, like I wouldn't call them nations, smaller ethnicities, they have simply not enough people. So like on average, they would like it, especially like if you're talking about old times, like say 19th century, it's not uncommon for such one person to meet like only like 20 people throughout whole life.
In this culture you're talking
about? In this culture.
Yeah, that's like I said, that I don't know anything about
and that's like creates a completely different dynamics. Like,
yeah, of course. That's yes.
And there are thousands of such.
Well, because you can't specialize in that case. Yeah. That's what happens is you're now doing everything, and you're, struggling to survive. Yes. And so they're basically in a scarcity of whole existence.
Scarcity of resources.
Yeah.
And like a constant like fight through life.
Yeah. I mean, that's we're babbling on about this, and it's like, and I don't know what it's going to prove. I'd like to, I'll read a little paper on it.
But they still have music and they still have language.
Yeah, they have language. So I'd want to know again a little bit more about that. But yeah, that doesn't surprise me, but they haven't developed artistically. In my view.
Perhaps our art is like tertiary, like maybe music first, like language second, and then.
Well, so I agree with the premise that the sounds we make, and having certain kinds of speech, and the musicality in terms of just singing is animalistic. And I agree with that. I've agreed with you the whole time.
Yeah.
That I don't agree. I think that other kinds of arts are a developed thing for sure. Cave paintings come after geometric signs, and I think that they were singing and dancing and speaking on some level for tens, hundreds of thousands of years before they did that. Yeah.
Modern papers, they basically tied to emergence of bipedalism. So as soon as like Australopithecus, like probably there was the first pre-humans like who could walk like straight and who were walking over large spaces, and now they say that it is very likely that they had like some kind of music language already, unlike like apes, like they like immediate predecessors.
Like I said,
and the reason for that is exactly because bipedalism it encourages a completely different, what they call mode of perception.
I mean, I think it's interesting just in terms of it has the story of where we came from.
Yeah.
I think there's an interesting part of that, adding to evolution, adding to the longevity of human beings and what we discover about what it means to be a human being. And I think that's very valuable. Again, I think the cave art painting is part of that story, but it comes later, probably much later. Yeah, and I agree with that completely. Which again is evidence of these people's primitiveness that we're talking about here.
Okay, like if you say so.
Well, I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. They have to be, if they can't even do cave art, like if they can't even draw a little pig, then conceptually their minds are very
there are no pigs there.
Yeah, but you know what I'm talking about. What do they eat?
Well, unfortunately, like...
No, but what do they eat? I'm asking...
Okay, well, they might eat like fish, for instance.
Okay, so they could draw fish.
Yeah, they could.
Yeah, the thing you draw first is the thing that takes up your whole world. So it's fish in their case, it's pig in the place of a person who lives in a place where there's pigs in it. Like the first cave painting they have that goes back the farthest is like a pig. Another example is just like predators. You often see like predators or how to take down, you'll see like different images. This is another development. So like first you'll just see an animal, but then later on, 10,000 years later or whatever, you'll see like 3 men and an animal. And you'll see a development in the sense that the animal, this is what's really interesting is, and we got to stop because this is going on forever. But the animal is usually more detailed than the humans.
Yes, that's true.
The humans are like stick figures with little sticks. And it's almost like they're doing like designing how to do a hunt. And they're kind of explaining this to people, but that's how the conceptual mind works, is it's conveying in a symbolic way in representational art. And then they're saying 2 here, 1 here, like it's almost like they're giving you the play-by-play for how to hunt a boar or something like that.
That's
right?
true.
And yeah, like I said, it's very interesting to me but again, to me, there's progress that occurs. Progress in conceptual development is a universal thing that is required for humans and is required for societies, and societies get them as well. And so a society that isn't at that level is less progressed than a society that is at that level. So
part of it is density of population, because one of the reasons why somebody like could like draw something, like if you have like for instance a tribe that consists of 30 people, it's likely that one of them would be capable of depicting it than if you have a society of just 5 people.
Yes. No,
and then the second one
I'm
is
not disagreeing with
permanence.
any of this.
Because like if you have a cave, well, what if you don't have a cave? Everything is snow. It's just plain surface covered by snow, no any landmarks at all. It's a completely different.
I don't know the terrain.
I'm going to draw on snow, then it will disappear like within few hours.
I don't know the terrain. I don't know the history of this culture. Yes, but that just means that they're primitive. That's all that means. What else do you call? I mean, lack of progression.
Okay.
I don't know what else.
Undeveloped, maybe you can say.
Yeah, but undeveloped into like conceptually. Not because obviously.
Well, that would reflect like what you were saying, that they can, but then they don't.
Well, that's what I said. Yeah.
Yeah. So that should be called undeveloped.
If I hit someone in the head with a hammer and they become a vegetable, they're a vegetable. Like that's just what they are. Their mind isn't working. So if you don't know how, if your whole culture nobody can, because I can't draw. I'm a terrible drawer, painter.
So would you?
But I could draw a dog No, because I used really advanced symbolic language in a very, very advanced way. So there is a kind of primitiveness in the lack of my ability to represent the world in images, but I've replaced that with a much more complicated symbol sound auditory system.
But like to be a fair judge, like these people also might be very sophisticated. For instance, in how they hunt, and they like much more sophisticated than we could be. Like if we.
Well, I'd want to know a little bit more about that, but my contention would be I don't see it possible that they are conceptually sophisticated, because concepts require some kind of representation for you to hold it and contemplate it and think about it and develop it and, refine it and get more precise on it, get the measurements on it. Like, you need to have a symbol system, even if that symbol system is at first representational in sense of just drawing the entity itself and then representing it like hieroglyphic type style and then representing it in, a phonetic type of language, auditory, visual system that's more complex. So that's a development. You could trace that development in cultures around the world that have developed. Mm-hmm. So if you think about it as like era 1, era 2, era 3, mm-hmm. 1 is this music, language, speech system, that's era 1. Okay. Yeah. And that's the most basic. And then era 2 is maybe geometric signs. Mm-hmm. Now you have tools like a little axe or a little hammer, you can hit stuff. And then you're like, hey, why don't I just draw 2 little circles or 2 little lines around this? It makes it more, and then era 3 is like, you start representing stuff. It's like, mm-hmm. that thing that I love because I eat, or that thing that keeps me alive is a fish. It looks like this. Okay. They draw that. And that's how they do that. And then they pass that on to the next people, the sacredness of the fish, and it becomes the fish god, and they're all, mm-hmm. and then they create deities, and that's how you have concept. And then the next step of that is you take that fish and you're like, what if we just did, because we have this complex trading system, mm-hmm. and I'm trading 50 fish. Let me just, draw it like this, I don't know, whatever, some little easy symbol, mm-hmm. and that represents that. And then I'll just say I have this, and then I'll make this numerical symbol, and that's how I'll do. So I don't know that that's exact progression, mm-hmm. but you could say that that's 5. So someone is just in the 1 phase, that mm-hmm. by definition, they're not in the 4 phase. Mm-hmm. So if we think about progression, if we think about 2, 3, 4 as a progression, mm-hmm. then it's a progression. They're not progressed.
Oh, I'm on the same page. Like there are evolutionary stages, and like some cultures might be more advanced and something are less advanced.
And the opposite of advanced is primitive. That's all I'm saying.
It's just like this word primitive for some reason. Like,
whatever, yeah. Okay, so on that note,
okay,
we'll stop this primitive conversation about art. Thank you.
All right, my pleasure.
Yeah, appreciate it. Okay.